The stagecoach had been rattling for 6 weeks straight, and Honora Selby had memorized every crack in its ceiling, every splinter along the bench, every groan the axle made when the road turned to nothing but ruts and prayer. She was 21 years old. She owned a cloth suitcase with a broken clasp, a letter from a man she had never met, and an ivory comb that had belonged to a mother she had never known. The comb was small, palm-sized, with teeth that had yellowed to the color of old cream. One tooth near the edge had snapped off years ago, maybe before Honora was born, maybe during the journey from wherever her mother had been to wherever her mother had died. On the spine, two letters had been carved in a careful hand. E.S., that was all. No first name, no story. Just initials on ivory cold and smooth against her fingers when she held it at night in whatever boarding house or way station. The coach stopped it pressed against her chest like a rosary for a saint she could not name. She had read the letter 400 times. She did not exaggerate this number. On the first day out of Boston, she read it 12 times. By the second week, she had it memorized, but she kept unfolding it anyway because the act of unfolding felt like arriving somewhere, and she had never arrived anywhere in her life. The letter was written in a hand so clean, it surprised her. She had expected a rancher's would scrawl something blunt and sideways, the kind of penmanship that came from hands more familiar with rope than ink. Instead, the letters were upright, evenly spaced, almost elegant. No flourishes, no wasted strokes, just precision. I have 600 acres of land, 40 head of cattle, and a cabin built to last. I need a woman who can read, who can cook, and who is not afraid of silence. If you accept, I will provide shelter, food, and respect. Sign it H. Drummond. No promise of love, no promise of happiness. Just shelter, food, and respect. For a girl who had grown up in a 40-bed orphanage where silence was a luxury and respect was something the older children beat out of the younger ones, those three words were more than enough. She liked the last line best, not afraid of silence. She had lived 21 years surrounded by noise, by the coughing of sick children, and the prayers of women who believed God listened more carefully if you spoke louder. She did not know what silence sounded like, but she wanted to. The coach pulled into Thornfield, Montana at noon on a Tuesday in October. The town was small, dry, sun-beaten, a wooden church with a crooked steeple, a general store with a painted sign that read Galt and Sons Provisions and Dry Goods, a saloon with no name, just a pair of swinging doors and the sound of someone playing a piano badly, a livery stable, a post office the size of a closet, and a boarding house with a wide porch and a woman standing on it, arms folded, watching the coach like she had been expecting it. Honora climbed down. Dust billowed around her skirt. Her boots hit the ground, and she stood there, a suitcase in one hand, the letter in the other, and looked around for the man who had written it. No one came. She stood in front of the post office for what felt like a long time. Men walked past and looked at her. Not cruelly, not kindly, just the way men in small towns looked at anything new. The way they might look at a horse they had not seen before measuring it, deciding whether it was worth the trouble. Women glanced and turned away, which was worse. Honora knew that turning away. She had seen it in Boston every time a family came to the orphanage looking for a child and passed over her for someone younger, someone with lighter hair, someone who smiled more easily. She was about to ask a passing man for directions when she heard the noise. It came from the far end of the street near the livestock market, a flat dirt lot bordered by fence posts and watering troughs where ranchers brought cattle to sell on the first and third Saturdays of every month. Today was not Saturday, but a crowd had gathered there anyway, maybe 15 or 20 people, mostly men, a few boys, and the sound they made was the sound crowds have always made when they have found something to stare at. Laughter that was not quite laughter. Voices pitched high with the particular excitement that comes from watching someone else suffer. Honora walked toward it. She did not know why. Later she would tell herself it was curiosity, but that was not quite right. It was something older than curiosity, something that lived in the part of her that had spent 21 years being looked past, looked over, looked through. She recognized the sound of a spectacle, and she knew without knowing how she knew that whatever was at the center of that crowd was not there by choice. She pushed through the bodies, elbows and shoulders, and the smell of tobacco and horse sweat, and then she saw him. He was chained to a hitching post. A heavy iron chain ran from his right wrist to the post short enough that he could sit but not stand fully long enough that he could shift his weight from one hip to the other. He sat on the bare ground, legs stretched in front of him, head bowed. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. His boots were gone. His hair, chestnut brown and matted with dust, fell across his forehead and hid his eyes. He was enormous. Even sitting, she could see that. Shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway. Arms thick with the kind of muscle that came not from vanity, but from years of swinging axes and hauling timber. Hands that could have wrapped around a fence post. But those hands were still. Everything about him was still. He sat like a man who had decided that movement was no longer worth the effort. A wooden sign had been hammered into the ground beside him. Someone had painted on it in red letters, sloppy misspelled, "Cattle Thief." $3 to look. $5 to throw something. A boy, maybe 12, picked up a clod of dirt and threw it. It hit the chained man's knee. He did not flinch, did not lift his head. The boy laughed and reached for another clod. A man beside him, probably his father, grinned and said nothing. Honora felt something tighten in her chest. Not pity. Pity was soft and it went away. This was harder. This was the feeling she got when she saw the younger children in the orphanage being locked in the cellar for crying too loudly. The feeling that something was wrong, not because the world was cruel, but because the people in it had decided that cruelty was entertainment. She grabbed the nearest arm. It belonged to an old woman chewing tobacco. "Who is that man?" Honora asked. The woman looked her up and down. "Ransom Drummond, caught driving McPhail's cattle onto Drummond land. Sheriff chained him up here for the town to deal with, seeing as the judge won't be through till spring." Honora's stomach dropped. Drummond. The name on her letter was Drummond. "Is he—" she started, then stopped. "Does he have brothers?" the old woman spat. "3 of them. Live up on Broken Ridge like bears. Hewitt, Ransom, and the young one, Prosper. Don't come down much. Don't talk much. Don't do much except make decent folks nervous." She looked at Honora with sudden interest. "Why you know them?" Honora did not answer. She was looking at Ransom Drummond, chained to a post in the middle of a livestock market, and she was thinking, "This is my husband's brother. This is the family I am walking into, and he is sitting in the dirt like an animal while people pay to throw things at him." She turned and walked back up the street, not running, but fast, her boots hitting the packed earth with purpose. She found the boarding house. The woman on the porch, the one who had been watching the coach, was still there, arms still folded, eyes still sharp. "You are Odette Fenn?" Honora asked. The woman nodded. She was perhaps 58, maybe older. Silver hair pulled back tight, a face that had been beautiful once and was now something better, a face that had seen enough to stop pretending. "And you are the mail-order bride." "How did you know?" "Because no woman comes to Thornfield on purpose unless she has been sent for. Come inside, eat something. Then we will talk." Inside the boarding house at a table near the kitchen, Odette set a bowl of stew in front of Honora and sat across from her. She did not ask about the journey or the weather or how Honora was feeling. She asked the only question that mattered. "Do you know what you are walking into?" Honora put down her spoon. The letter said H. Drummond. One name, one man. Odette nodded slowly. "Hewitt wrote the letter, but Hewitt is not alone. There are 3 of them. 3 brothers. One cabin, top of Broken Ridge." She paused, letting the words settle. "They need a woman in that house. Someone to cook, to keep the place from falling into ruin, to make it feel less like a problem and more like a home. None of them means you any harm. But you need to know the truth before you go up that mountain." "Tell me about them," Honora said. Odette leaned back. "Hewitt is the oldest, 31, big as a barn door and twice as quiet. He does not talk. I do not mean he is shaman. I mean he has not spoken a word to anyone in this town in 5 years. Maybe more. He writes, he gestures, he works harder than any man I have ever seen. But he will not open his mouth. There is a reason. I do not know it entirely, but it has to do with their mother." "What happened to their mother?" "Darla Drummond died 6 years ago. Lung sickness. Took her slow. By the end, she could not breathe without coughing blood. The boys nursed her as best they could, but there is no doctor within 50 miles of Broken Ridge. She died in that cabin in the room you will be sleeping in." Honora did not flinch. She had shared sleeping space with children who died of scarlet fever. Death in a bed was not new to her. Ransom is the middle one, Odette continued. 30, hot-tempered, says everything Hewitt will not. He loved a woman once a few years back. She stayed 2 weeks on the mountain, then left. Wrote him a note that said she could not live with men who only knew dirt. He has not trusted a woman from the valley since. And the third, Prosper, 29, gentlest of the three, taught himself to heal with herbs and old medicine books. He is the one who keeps the peace between Hewitt and Ransom, which is like keeping peace between a stone wall and a thunderstorm. Prosper believes bringing you up that mountain is the only thing that will save those boys from turning into the mountain itself. Honora sat with this for a moment. Then she said, the man in the livestock market. Ransom. He is chained to a post. Odette's mouth tightened. Cattle dispute. McPhail says Ransom stole his stock. Ransom says the cattle wandered across the boundary line, which they do every autumn when the grass dries out. Sheriff Whitlow does not care about the truth. He cares about who pays him. McPhail pays. So Ransom sits in chains while the town treats him like a sideshow. Can he be released? $20 bail, set by the sheriff who has the legal authority of a fence post, but the stubbornness of a mule. Honora opened her coin purse. $14. The orphanage had given her that when she left, along with a note that said, "May God guide your steps," which she had found less useful than the money. $14 was not 20. She looked at the ivory comb on the table beside her bowl. She had set it down when she sat the way she always did, where she could see it. E.S., her mother. Her only proof that she had come from somewhere, that she had not simply appeared in a Boston orphanage, like something left on a doorstep by the wind. Honora picked up the comb. She held it in both hands, feeling the smooth spine, the delicate teeth, the gap where the broken one had been for as long as she could remember. She closed her eyes. The comb was cool. It smelled like nothing like old bone like years. She had held it every night of her life. It was the only thing in the world that belonged to her, and the only thing that proved someone had once, however briefly, belonged to her. She opened her eyes. The general store. Will they buy ivory? Odette looked at her for a long time. You would sell your mother's comb. I would sell my mother's comb to free a man who is chained to a post in a livestock market, because I cannot ride up that mountain and sit at that table and look his brothers in the eye, knowing I left him there. Odette studied her. Something shifted in the older woman's face, something that looked like the beginning of respect. Galt will give you $7, maybe $8 for it. Ivory is ivory, even old. Honora stood. Then that is what I will do. She walked to the general store. The bell above the door rang thin and bright. The man behind the counter had a clerk's posture and a merchant's eyes. His wife, Lorette Galt, stood near the back folding fabric and watched without appearing to watch. Honora set the comb on the counter. How much for this? The man turned it in his fingers. $7, ivory but old, one tooth missing. 7.5, he looked at her. She did not blink. 7.5, he agreed. Honora took the money. Her hand trembled when she picked up the coins, but her face did not change. 21 years of practice. She walked out without looking at Lorette Galt, though she felt the woman's eyes on her back like sunlight through a magnifying glass. She walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Whitlow sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, a man who had found his authority in furniture. I want to post bail for Ransom Drummond, Honora said. Whitlow looked at her. And who are you, Honora Selby, promised bride of Hewitt Drummond? Ransom is family. The sheriff laughed, not a mean laugh exactly, the laugh of a man who has heard something he will tell at the saloon later. A mail-order bride posting bail for a cattle thief. That is a story. Is the money good or not? He counted it, $21.50. He pocketed the extra $1.50 without comment, took a key from his desk and walked with her to the livestock market. The crowd had thinned but not disappeared. A few men still loitered, drinking, waiting for something else to happen. The sheriff unlocked the chain. It fell against the post with a sound like a church bell struck wrong. Ransom Drummond did not move. He sat there wrist-free, head still bowed as if he had not noticed. Get up, Drummond, the sheriff demanded. Your bail is paid. Slowly, Ransom lifted his head. His eyes were amber sharp, full of a fury that had nowhere to go. He looked at the sheriff, then he looked past him at Honora. She was small, dust on her hem, hair coming loose from its pins. a cloth suitcase at her feet, and no comb in her pocket because she had sold it 20 minutes ago for a man she had never met. "Who are you?" His voice was rough like gravel dragged across wood. "I am Honora Selby, your brother's mail-order bride. Stand up. We are going home." He stared at her. She stared back. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ransom Drummond pushed himself to his feet. He was tall, far taller than she had expected. The chain had left a red ring around his wrist that would take weeks to fade. He looked down at her from that height and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had bought his freedom with her mother's only relic, and he did not even know her name until she told him. They left Thornfield together. Ransom rode his horse, which the sheriff had held in the livery, and Honora rode Pepper, the old mule Odette lent her, with the instruction, "If the mule stops, do not force it. It stops for a reason." The road up Broken Ridge was narrow and steep, cut into the mountainside like a scar. On one side, pine trees and rock. On the other, nothing, just air. In the distant valley floor, green and gold in the October light. Ransom rode ahead. He did not look back. He did not speak. His back was straight and his jaw was set, and Honora understood even then that his silence was not the same as his brother's. Hewitt was silent because he had chosen not to speak. Ransom was silent because he was ashamed. A woman he had never met had sold something precious to free him from a hitching post, and he did not know how to carry that debt. It burned in him. She could see it in the rigid line of his shoulders and the way he held the reins too tight. They climbed for half a day. The air grew thinner and colder. The pines grew taller. Honora's fingers went numb on the reins, but she did not complain because complaining required someone to complain to, and she had spent her whole life without that luxury. Near the summit, Pepper stopped. The mule planted its hooves and would not move, not for pulling, not for coaxing, not for the sharp click of Honora's tongue. She looked up. Two figures stood on the ridge above, silhouetted against the sky. Both were large, broad-shouldered, but not identical. The one on the left was taller, wider, darker-haired. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, like something carved from the mountain itself. The one on the right was slightly smaller, leaner, and his mouth was turned up at one corner in something that was almost but not quite a smile. Neither came down to help her. Honora dismounted, took Pepper's lead, and walked the last 100 yards on foot, pulling the reluctant mule behind her. When she reached the top, breathing hard, sweat on her temples, despite the cold, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said, "I am Honora Selby. Which of you is Hewitt Drummond?" The taller one stepped forward. One step, that was all. He did not offer his hand, did not nod, just looked at her with amber eyes so deep and staring that Honora felt for one disorienting moment that she was being read like a page in a book. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin without a word. Ransom swung down from his horse and led it toward the stable without looking at anyone. The almost smiling one, Prosper, stepped forward and took her suitcase. "You are Honora, I am Prosper. Thank you for bringing our brother home." His voice was warm, the first warm thing she had encountered since Boston. "Come inside. I have hot porridge." Honora followed him, but she looked back once. Hewitt had stopped on the porch. He had turned around and was watching her. When their eyes met, he looked away. Not out of indifference. She could see that already. He looked away because he did not know what to do when someone looked back. The cabin sat on a rocky promontory overlooking a wide valley ringed by mountains. Their father, Amos Drummond, had built it 25 years ago from lodgepole pine, with a slate roof and a stone chimney, and a porch that faced west toward the sunset. It was not beautiful, it was solid. 3 small bedrooms, a large kitchen, a common room with a stone hearth, and a store room attached to the north wall. Behind the cabin, a stable, a chicken coop, and a fenced pasture where dark shapes moved slowly in the fading afternoon light. Honora was given their mother's room. It was small and clean. A wooden bed frame with a straw mattress, a small table beside it, a cracked mirror on the wall, and on the table a jar of wildflowers freshly picked, purple asters and goldenrod stems still damp. "Who put the flowers here?" she asked Prosper. He glanced toward Hewitt's room, the corner of his mouth twitching, but said nothing. The first supper was a trial. Prosper cooked venison stew with potatoes and herbs. Honora did not recognize something piney and sharp that made the broth taste like the forest itself. Ransom sat at the far end of the table, ate fast, and left without looking at her. Prosper tried to make conversation, asked about Boston, the orphanage, the journey. Honora answered in short sentences. She was still processing the fact that her husband was three people. Hewitt sat across from her. He did not eat. He held a small knife and a piece of pale wood, and he carved. The sound of the blade on wood was the only communication between them, a soft, rhythmic scraping, steady as a heartbeat. Honora watched his hands. They were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, calloused to leather. But they moved with a precision that contradicted their size, the knife turning in his fingers like a living thing. She asked him directly, "Your letter was well written. Why do you not speak?" Hewitt did not look up. The knife kept moving. Prosper leaned forward gently. "Our brother chooses not to speak. It is a long story. You will understand when you understand." Honora nodded. She did not press. The orphanage had taught her patience the way the ocean teaches stones, by wearing them down until they fit. But she had another question. "Why did your letter not mention there were three of you?" Hewitt's knife stopped. He looked up at her. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw tightened. Slowly, he reached for a stick near the hearth and drew on the dirt floor beside his chair. A small house, three stick figures standing in front of it, and beside them a large question mark. Honora studied the drawing. "You were afraid I would not come." He nodded once. "You were right," she said. "I would not have come." A silence filled the room like water filling a well. "But I am here now," she said. Hewitt looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his knife and returned to the wood. But something in the angle of his shoulders had changed, something almost imperceptible, like the slightest shift in a mountain shadow when the sun moves 1 degree. That night, Honora lay on Darla Drummond's bed in Darla Drummond's room under a quilt that still smelled faintly of pine and lavender and the particular sweetness of a woman who had lived in these walls for 20 years. She held the empty space in her palm where the ivory comb used to, her fingers closed around nothing. From the porch, she heard the sound of a blade on wood, steady, rhythmic, unhurried. She did not know which brother was carving, but the sound filled the dark, way a lantern fills a room, not by pushing the darkness out, but by giving it a shape. She fell asleep to that sound, and for the first time in 21 years, she did not hear 39 other children turning in their sleep around her. She heard only the knife in the wind and the enormous silence of a mountain that did not ask her to be anything other than what she was. 3 days passed before the comb's absence was noticed. Not by Honora, who felt it every minute, but by Prosper, who saw things the way some people hear music without trying, without being able to stop. He watched her at the wash basin on the third morning, running her fingers through her hair the way a woman does when she has no tool, pulling gently at the tangles, working from the ends up. It was a small gesture. Most men would not have noticed. But Prosper had spent 7 years watching plants grow, tracking the subtle differences between a leaf that was thriving and one that was dying, and he recognized the absence of something essential. "Do you not have a comb?" he asked. Honora's hands paused. "I sold it," she said simply. Prosper was quiet, then he understood. The bail money, $14 in her purse, $20 needed. The ivory comb, old, one tooth broken, worth 7.5 at Galt's. She had sold her mother's comb to free Ransom from a hitching post. He did not say this aloud. He did not tell Honora he understood. But that evening, after she had gone to bed, he sat with Hewitt on the porch in the cold October dark and told him. Hewitt did not move. The knife in his hand went still. He stared at the wood in his lap as if it had spoken to him in a language he had forgotten. Then he set the carving aside, stood, and walked into the storeroom. Prosper heard him rummaging. After several minutes, Hewitt emerged carrying a piece of deer bone, long, dense, ivory-colored. He sat down on the porch and began to work. Prosper did not ask what he was making. He already knew. Ransom was the hardest. He avoided Honora the way a man avoids a mirror when he does not want to see what he has become. He left before dawn and returned after dark. When forced to be in the same room, he kept his eyes on the wall, the floor, the fire, anywhere but on the small woman who had paid for his freedom with the only thing her dead mother had left her. It was not hatred. Honora understood that by the second week. It was shame. Ransom Drummond was the proudest of the three brothers, the one who measured himself by what he could carry, what he could lift, what he could endure. And now he owed a debt to a woman half his size who had done for him what he could not do for himself. That debt sat in his chest like a stone. He could not swallow and could not spit out. On the eighth night, he came out to the porch where Nora sat alone watching the stars. He stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the dark. Then he spoke low and rough. "Why did you do it? You did not know me. I could have been guilty." And Nora did not look at him. "You could have been. But you do not chain a man to a post in a livestock market and let people throw things at him guilty or not. That is not justice. That is sport." Ransom was quiet for a long time. "You are foolish," he said. "Maybe. But you are here, not at the post." He turned and went inside. But when Honora went to her room, she found something on the floor outside her door. A piece of dried venison wrapped in a broad leaf. Ransom's own ration. He had given her his portion without saying a word. She ate it slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed, and thought about the different languages men speak when they will not use words. Hewitt spoke in wildflowers and carved wood. Prosper spoke in hot porridge and herb names. And Ransom spoke in dried meat left on a doorstep because he could not yet bring himself to hand it to her directly. At the end of the second week, Honora sat by the fire. In her hand was the last letter from the matron of St. Catherine's, the final safety net, an address for a church in Denver that took in women in difficulty. She had carried it in her pocket since Boston. If everything went wrong, she could write to them. She could leave. She looked at the letter. Then she looked up. Hewitt sat across the fire carving. Ransom leaned against the porch post, eyes on the darkness. Prosper sat on the step reading a medical book with a spine so broken it looked like it had been dropped from a horse. 3 men, 3 kinds of loneliness. 1 cabin on top of a mountain that had not heard a woman's voice in 6 years. Honora folded the letter, slowly, carefully. Then she leaned forward and placed it in the fire. The paper curled, browned, blackened, became ash. She did not explain. She did not need to. Prosper saw it. He smiled small and real. Ransom, she did not know he was watching, but his shoulders dropped a fraction, a tension she had not noticed until it was gone. And Hewitt stopped carving. He looked up at her across the flames, and in his amber eyes she saw something she had never seen from anyone in 21 years of living. Not gratitude, not love, not even warmth exactly. Recognition. The simple, steady acknowledgement of one person seeing another. "I see you. You are here, and that is enough." Then Hewitt reached into his coat pocket and drew out a thin strip of braided leather. At one end hung a single bead, small, round, carved from bone, sanded smooth until it gleamed in the firelight. He leaned forward and set it on the ground between them. Then he picked up his knife and went back to carving as if nothing had happened. Honora picked up the leather cord. The bone bead was warm from his pocket. It had no particular shape, no symbol. Just a small, smooth, perfect circle of bone, polished by hands that had spent hours on it, maybe days. She tied it around her wrist. She did not ask what it meant. On this mountain, asking too much was a kind of trespass. The answer would come when it was ready. She lay down that night with the bead against her pulse, feeling it rise and fall with her heartbeat. And she thought for the first time in her life that she understood what silence sounded like. It sounded like bone against skin, like a knife on wood, like wildflowers placed on a windowsill before dawn by hands that would never admit they had been there. It sounded like the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. But she would, in time, one beat at a time. The third week on Broken Ridge settled into a rhythm that Honora learned the way she had once learned hymns at the orphanage, not by understanding them, but by letting them repeat until they became part of her breathing. Hewitt rose before dawn. She never heard him wake, never heard his door open or his boots hit the floor. He was simply gone before the first gray light touched the window pane. And the only evidence he had been in the cabin at all was the fresh, split firewood stacked beside the hearth and always the wildflower on her windowsill. Purple aster one morning, goldenrod the next, mountain lupine, Indian paintbrush, white yarrow, each one different. Each one placed in the same spot stem, angled toward the glass so the first sunlight would catch the petals. She never saw him do it. She never mentioned it. But she kept everyone pressing them between the pages of Prosper's medical book when the petals began to curl, until the book became a garden of its own, flat and fragrant and secret. Ransom left shortly after first light, riding west to the grazing pasture were the 40 head of Drummond cattle spread across high meadow grass that would not last much longer before the snow came. He took jerky and a canteen and stayed gone until the light turned amber, sometimes later. He was building fence, Prosper explained. Replacing posts that the summer storms had loosened. It was work for two men, but Ransom did it alone because Ransom did everything alone, because being alone meant no one could leave him. Prosper stayed closest. He tended the herb garden behind the cabin, a patch of earth their mother had started, and he had expanded into something that looked to Honora's untrained eye like organized wildness. Rows of sage and chamomile, echinacea in clay pots, feverfew along the fence, willow bark drying on a wooden rack. He moved through it with the quiet confidence of a man who had found the one thing in the world he was good at and had decided to be very good at it indeed. It was Prosper who taught Honora the mountain, not its geography, though that too, but its language. He showed her which plants stopped fever willow bark steeped in boiling water, which ones stopped bleeding yarrow leaves pressed into a wound with pressure and patience, which ones were death in a green dress hemlock, with its white flowers and its smell of rot growing in the wet shade near the creek as casually as something innocent. Never touch this, he said, kneeling beside a cluster of hemlock, so calmly he might have been introducing her to a neighbor. Not the stem, not the flower, not the root. Wash your hands if you brush it by accident. What does it do? Honora asked. It stops your lungs from remembering how to breathe. She did not touch it. They talked easily, Honora and Prosper. He was the only one of the three she could hold a conversation with, and she realized gradually that this was not accidental. Prosper had positioned himself as the bridge between her and his brothers, the interpreter, the translator of silences. When Hewitt carved something she did not understand, Prosper explained. When Ransom slammed a door, Prosper contextualized. He did it without condescension, without the air of a man explaining lesser creatures to a newcomer. He simply offered information and let her do with it what she would. He told her about their mother, not all at once, but in pieces, the way a man feeds a fire one stick at a time so it burns steady instead of flaring out. She used to sing when she cooked, Prosper said one afternoon, elbow deep in sage plants, his voice so casual it almost hid the ache beneath it. She said a house without singing was like an empty shell, something that looked like a home from the outside but had nothing living in it. Honora thought about this. She had never been sung to. The matrons at St. Catherine's believed that music was a privilege earned through obedience, and Honora had never been obedient enough. But she knew one song, a lullaby hummed by a night nurse, whose name she had forgotten, a woman who was there for one winter and then was gone like everything warm in Honora's childhood. She remembered the melody, the way one remembers the shape of a room, in a house one lived in briefly as a child imperfectly, but with a longing that made the imperfections irrelevant. The next morning while making porridge, she hummed it, softly, not even singing really, just letting the melody move through her lips like steam from the pot. She did not know Hewitt was outside the window. He had been walking past carrying an axe over one shoulder, headed for the timber stand on the north slope. When the sound reached him, he stopped, set the axe head on the ground, leaned his back against the cabin wall, and stood there, eyes closed, listening until the last note dissolved into the sound of the porridge bubbling and the fire crackling and the morning birds starting up in the pines. Then he picked up the axe and walked away. Prosper, sitting in the common room with his book, had seen him through the gap in the door. He watched his oldest brother stand motionless against the wall with his eyes closed, and he smiled not at Hewitt, not at Honora, but at something larger, something he had been hoping for since the day he had convinced Hewitt to write that letter. That evening, Prosper gave Honora the second bead. It was different from Hewitt's, made not from bone, but from greenstone, a pale blue-green river pebble he had found years ago and polished smooth over months of idle work. Into its surface, he had carved a single tiny leaf so fine she had to hold it to the firelight to see it. A leaf falls when it is ready, he said, not when the wind demands it. Do not let anyone push you, not even us. Honora turned the bead in her fingers. It was cool and heavy for its size, like a small piece of the mountain itself. She added it to the leather cord on her wrist beside the bone bead. 2 beads now, 2 brothers, 2 languages for the same unspoken thing. The change in Ransom came the way weather changes in the high country, not gradually but in a single moment that redefined everything before and after it. It was the 5th week. October had deepened into something that tasted like iron, when Honora breathed in. The creek was cold enough to numb her fingers in seconds. She was kneeling on the bank scrubbing a shirt against a flat rock when her boots slipped on the wet stone. Her knee went sideways. Her hands lost the rock. She went into the water. It was not deep, barely to her waist, but the cold was a violence she had not expected. It seized her lungs, locked her muscles, turned her blood to something thick and unwilling. She gasped and grabbed for the bank, but her fingers slid on mud and she went under for 1 second, 2 seconds, three, and the current gentle, as it looked from above, had opinions about where she should go. Then a hand closed around her arm. It was not gentle, it was not careful. It was a grip that could have bent iron, and it hauled her out of the creek in a single motion so powerful that her feet left the ground entirely. She landed on the bank, coughing, soaked, shaking, and looked up into Ransom Drummond's face. He was breathing hard. Not from exertion, she realized later, but from something else. His eyes were wide and his jaw was clamped, and for one unguarded moment she saw past the anger and the pride and the 4 years of distrust, and what she saw was fear. Simple, raw animal fear. The fear of a man who had almost watched someone drown in 3 feet of water. He released her arm, stepped back, rebuilt his face. "Watch yourself," he said, his voice rough and flat. "This creek has pulled down cattle heavier than you." Then he walked away. Back to the pasture, back to the fence posts, back to the work that kept him separate from everything he was afraid to lose. That night, Honora found a thick wool blanket folded on the floor outside her bedroom door. She recognized it. It was Ransom's. She had seen it on his bed the one time his door was open. He slept that night with nothing but his coat, and the temperature on Broken Ridge dropped to 26 degrees. She did not thank him the next morning. She understood by now that thanks were a currency that did not trade well on this mountain. Instead, she found a basket of old yarn in Darla Drummond's closet wool that had been spun but never used, and over the course of 3 evenings, she knit a pair of gloves. She left them on Ransom's bed without a note. The next morning, he wore them to the pasture. He did not mention them. He wore them every day after that, every single day. Even when the fingers wore thin and the wool began to pill, and the left thumb developed a hole that she quietly mended one night while he slept. There was a conversation happening between Honora Selby and Ransom Drummond. It was conducted entirely in objects: a blanket for a rescue, gloves for a blanket, a mended thumb for the wearing of the gloves. Neither of them acknowledged it. Both of them knew. The evening that changed everything between Honora and Hewitt came at the end of the 5th week on a night so clear the stars looked close enough to cut yourself on. Honora sat on the porch working her fingers through her hair. Without a comb, the tangles had become a daily negotiation, a patient unraveling that took longer each evening as the dry mountain air and the wind conspired against her. She worked from the ends upward, the way the night nurse at the orphanage had once shown her: gentle, methodical, slow. It was an intimate thing, this ritual, and she usually did it inside in her room with the door closed. But tonight the sky was too large to ignore, and she had thought she was alone. She was not. Hewitt sat at the far end of the porch, half hidden by shadow, carving something she could not see. She had not noticed him when she came out. He was that still. A man his size should not have been able to disappear into a shadow, but Hewitt Drummond had spent years practicing the art of being present without being seen. She became aware of him only when the carving stopped. The rhythmic scraping of the blade went silent, and in the silence she heard him set the knife down on the planks. Then the creak of wood as he stood. She did not move. She did not turn around. She heard his boots on the porch boards, 2 steps, 3, 4, and then he was behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her back, which was remarkable because the night was cold and he radiated heat like a stove. His hands came up. She saw them at the edge of her vision, enormous, scarred, steady. They hovered for a moment as if asking a question his mouth could not form. Then gently, with a precision that made her breath catch, he gathered her hair into 3 sections, and he braided. Honora sat perfectly still. Not from fear. She had never been afraid of Hewitt. It was something else, something she had no name for, something that lived in the center of her chest and expanded with each pass of his fingers through her hair. No one had ever touched her hair before. Not the matrons who cut it short when she was young to prevent lice. Not the night nurse who had only shown her how to detangle it but had never done it for her. Certainly not any man, because no man had ever stood close enough to her to try. Hewitt's hands were calloused and rough hands that split firewood and killed bears and carved tiny animals from cedar. But they moved through her hair as if it were something precious, something that could be damaged by carelessness. Each pass was deliberate. Each cross of the sections was exact. He braided the way he carved with the focused attention of a man who believed that everything worth doing was worth doing, as if it were the last thing he would ever do. When he finished, he tied the end with a strip of leather. She felt him thread the beads onto the braid, the bone bead first, then the greenstone leaf. They hung at the tail of the braid like small weights pulling it straight. Then he sat down, picked up his knife, resumed carving, as if nothing had happened. His hands were trembling. She could see it in the slight unsteadiness of the blade against the wood, a tremor so small that anyone else would have missed it. But Honora had spent her whole life reading small signals, the tightening of a matron's mouth that meant punishment was coming, the shift of a child's eyes that meant they were about to steal your bread. She saw the tremor. She understood what it cost him. She reached behind her head and touched the braid. It was tight, clean, perfect. Better than anything she had ever done herself. She did not thank him. She did not turn around. She just sat there looking at the stars with her braid resting on her shoulder and two beads hanging against her collarbone, and she let the silence hold what words would have ruined. On this mountain, enough was everything. 6 weeks in, Honora rode down to Thornfield with Prosper to buy flour and salt. The general store was the only option. Lorette Galt stood behind the counter like a sentry, her dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. "You are the Drummond bride," Lorette said. Not a question. "I am," Honora replied. "Which one?" The store went quiet. Two women near the fabric bowl stopped pretending to shop. "I came at Hewitt Drummond's invitation," Honora said. Lorette's eyebrows rose a fraction. "But you live with all three." "I have my own room. I cook and keep house. The arrangement is clear." A young woman, three unmarried men, a mountaintop. Lorette folded her hands on the counter. In Boston, what would they call that? Prosper stepped forward, his voice calm but his eyes hard. "Mrs. Galt, we came for salt, not commentary." Honora lifted her hand, slightly stopping him. She looked at Lorette Galt and recognized her immediately. Not the woman herself, but the type. Every orphanage had one. The benefactress who donated blankets at Christmas and withheld them the rest of the year. The board member who spoke about saving children while making sure they knew exactly how fallen they were. Women who weaponize virtue the way men weaponize fists. "I have three men who watch over me, Mrs. Galt," Honora said quietly. "Please wrap the order." On the ride back up the mountain, Prosper was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Lorette Galt is not dangerous because she is cruel. She is dangerous because she believes she is kind." Honora nodded. She knew this species of danger intimately. It wore clean dresses and spoke in measured tones and destroyed people by saving them from themselves. The 8th week brought the turn Honora had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She was cleaning the storeroom, an overdue task that involved dust and spiders and the particular smell of things left too long in the dark. Behind a stack of unused traps on a shelf she had to stretch to reach, she found a wooden box. Small, plain latched, but not locked. She opened it. Inside was a comb. Not the ivory comb she had sold. This was different. This was new. Carved from deer bone, pale and smooth, each tooth filed to a uniform thinness, each edge sanded until it would pass through hair without catching. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that took not hours but weeks, shaping each tooth individually, testing it, adjusting, starting over when it was not right. On the spine, 2 letters had been carved in a hand she recognized. The same hand that wrote the letter that brought her here. The same hand that carved wooden animals and tied braids and set wildflowers on windowsills before dawn. E.S., her mother's initials. On a comb made from bone, made by a man who had never asked what the initials stood for, who had only heard from Prosper that she had sold a comb with those letters to free his brother, and who had spent 5 weeks in the dark of the storeroom, carving, sanding, carving again, creating something new to replace what was lost. Honora sat down on the storeroom floor. She held the comb in both hands, and she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way a woman cries who has spent 21 years building walls and has just felt one of them crack, not from the outside, but from within. She cried because no one in her entire life had ever observed her closely enough to see what she was missing, and then quietly, without announcement, without expectation of thanks, it made it whole. He had not repaired the old comb. He could not. It was gone, sold at Galt's counter for $7.50. But he had done something harder. He had created something new and carved onto it the only thing he knew mattered to her. Two letters from a mother she had never met, placed there by hands that had not spoken a word in 5 years, but had said more in bone and blade than most men say in a lifetime. She washed her face in the basin. She dried her eyes. She walked out to the porch where Hewitt sat carving in the last light of afternoon. She placed the comb on his knee. He looked at it, then at her. She smiled. Her eyes were still faintly red. "Thank you," she said softly. "It is more beautiful than the one I lost." Hewitt nodded once. Then he picked up the comb, reached behind her, and drew it through her braid one time. Slowly, from the crown of her head to the tips. A single pass. Then he set the comb in her hand. His fingers touched hers for 1 second. Warm, rough, light as breath. And Nora sat on that porch until the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the valley filled with purple shadow. And she thought home is not a place. Home is the person who makes something new for you when the old thing is gone, without being asked, without being told, without needing anything in return except the knowledge that you will use it. The first real storm of winter arrived in the 9th week, a 3-day blizzard that buried the trails and turned the world outside the cabin into a white howling nothing. The four of them were trapped together, which was how the truth about Ransom finally came loose. It was the second night of the storm. The fire was high and the windows rattled, and the cold pressed against the cabin walls like something alive trying to get in. Honora was sewing, Prosper was reading, Hewitt was carving. Ransom sat apart drinking from a leather flask. Not drunk, but loosened. The storm had worn down whatever mechanism he used to keep his mouth shut. "You want to know why I have been hard on you," he said. Honora looked up from her needle. Her name was Marguerite. She came through Thornfield 4 years ago. Pretty, smart. She laughed at my jokes, which should have been the first warning. A bitter smile. "I brought her up here. She stayed 2 weeks, said she loved the view, said she loved the quiet, said she could see herself here." He paused. The fire cracked. "Then one morning I woke up and she was gone. No goodbye. Just a note on the table. I cannot live with men who only know dirt." He stared into his flask. "She was not wrong. That is the part that sticks. She was not wrong about us. We do only know dirt. Dirt and cattle and fence posts and the way the snow falls different on the north slope than the south. That is all we know. That is all we are." He looked at Honora. His eyes, usually sharp with anger, were something else now. Open, tired, afraid. "I am not angry at you," he said. "I am angry at myself for wanting to believe you will stay. Because the last time I believed that, I woke up to a note and an empty bed and 4 years of not trusting anyone with a suitcase." Honora set the needle down. She stood and walked to where Ransom sat. She lowered herself to the floor in front of him, close enough that he could see her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She had done her crying in the storeroom. This was not the time for tears. This was the time for truth. "I have never heard anyone say I love you to me," she said. "Not once, not in 21 years. So I do not know what I am missing. I do not know what that word sounds like in someone else's mouth. But I know what it looks like. It looks like a blanket left outside a door on a cold night. It looks like gloves worn every day, even when the thumb gets a hole. It looks like a man who pulls a woman out of a creek and walks away because he does not know how to say, 'I was scared.'" Ransom's jaw was working. His hands gripped the flask until his knuckles whitened. "I will stay," she said, "not because I have nowhere to go, because I have somewhere to be. Every day, until you believe it." He did not speak again that night. Neither did she. But when she passed his chair on the way to bed, he did not turn away. He looked at her, and she looked back, and for the first time there was no wall between them. Just two people who had been left recognizing each other. In the morning, on the windowsill of Honora's room beside the latest wildflower from Hewitt, sat a small wooden bead, carved from cedar. Shaped like a mountain peak, rough-edged, imperfect, the work of a man whose hands were built for fence posts. Not fine detail. But he had made it, and he had left it. Honora held it in her palm and smiled. Then she threaded it onto the leather cord and tied it into her braid beside the other two. 3 beads now: bone from Hewitt, greenstone leaf from Prosper, wooden mountain from Ransom. 3 men, 3 languages, 1 braid. Also in the 9th week, Prosper came back from town with news that wiped the color from his face. Laurette Galt had collected signatures. 14 women in Thornfield had signed a petition addressed to Judge Alton Birch, the circuit judge who rode through the territory every 6 months and was expected in March. The petition stated that a young unmarried woman was cohabiting with 3 unmarried men under immoral circumstances and requested the judge place her under the guardianship of the church or a charitable institution for her own protection. Honora listened without expression. Then she asked, "If the judge agrees, what happens?" Prosper answered honestly. "You would be removed, sent to Denver or back to Boston. We would have no legal standing to prevent it." Ransom heard this and his reaction was immediate and violent. He stood so fast his chair hit the wall. "I will ride down there and end this." Hewitt was already at the door, not blocking it with a hand or a word, blocking it with himself, all 6.5 feet of his shoulders, filling the frame, face expressionless, immovable as the mountain he lived on. Ransom squared up to his brother. They were nearly the same height, but Hewitt was wider, denser, and something in his stillness communicated a finality that Ransom's fury could not match. For a long moment they stood chest to chest, and the cabin held its breath. Honora spoke from behind them. "If either of you rides down that mountain and confronts Laurette Galt, she will add your behavior to the petition as evidence that this household is violent and unfit. That is exactly what she wants. That is how this game is played." Both men turned to look at her. She stood in the kitchen doorway, small, calm, her braid, with its 3 beads resting on her shoulder. "I need to marry," she said, "legally, before the judge arrives. A wife living with her husband and his brothers is not immoral, it is ordinary." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Honora had ever heard. She looked at Hewitt. "You wrote the letter. You invited me. In the eyes of the law, that is a promise of marriage, if you are willing." Hewitt looked at her. The look lasted a long time. It was not the look of a man deciding. It was the look of a man who had already decided long ago in a storeroom where he carved a comb from bone and was only now being asked to admit it. He nodded. Once, slow, certain. Ransom turned away. His jaw worked. Prosper watched his middle brother with careful eyes, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. Honora understood. Ransom was not jealous. Ransom was terrified. If Honora married Hewitt, she became real. She became permanent. And permanent things could be lost permanently. And Ransom Drummond had decided 4 years ago that nothing permanent was worth the risk. But he did not object. He walked out to the porch, put his fists on the railing, and stared at the dark valley below. And after a while, the tension in his shoulders eased, not because the fear went away, but because something stronger than fear had taken root in him and would not let go. The blizzard of the 10th week was the worst in a decade. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the basin beside Honora's bed overnight, a disk of ice she had to crack with her knuckle each morning. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. The trails vanished. The world beyond the porch became a white void that swallowed sound and direction and hope. Prosper went out on the second day of the storm to check the trap line on the east slope. He should not have gone. Ransom told him not to go. Hewitt blocked the door, and for the second time in 2 weeks, someone had to face the wall of Hewitt Drummond's body to leave the cabin. But Prosper argued calmly, logically, the way he always did. The traps held animals that would freeze and rot and attract predators to the homestead. The east slope trail was sheltered by rock and manageable even in heavy snow. He would be back before dark. He was not back before dark. Hewitt found him at dusk 2 miles from the cabin, lying in the snow at the base of a granite outcrop. His horse had slipped on a shelf of ice, hidden beneath fresh powder. The animal had gone down sideways rolling, and Prosper had gone with it. His left leg was broken below the knee. The bone had not pierced the skin, but the angle was wrong, visibly, sickeningly wrong, and Prosper was unconscious when Hewitt reached him. Lips blue, snow collecting in the creases of his coat. Hewitt carried him home. 2 miles uphill through a blizzard with a grown man over his shoulder. He did not run. Running in deep snow with a broken body on your back is a good way to create 2 casualties instead of 1. He walked, Steady grinding relentless, each step deliberate, each breath a decision to take another. Honora heard the boots on the porch heavier than usual, a rhythmic, the sound of a man carrying more than he should. She opened the door and saw Hewitt standing in the swirling white Prosper draped over his shoulder, and for one terrible moment she thought Prosper was dead. Then she saw the cloud of breath from his mouth faint but there, and she moved. "Bring him in. Put him on the table." She swept the table clear with one arm. Plates and cups hit the floor. Hewitt laid his brother down as gently as a man that large could manage, which was gentler than anyone would have expected. Prosper's leg was a problem. The only person on this mountain who knew how to set a bone was the man whose bone was broken. Honora looked at the leg, looked at the medical book on the shelf, looked at Hewitt and Ransom standing in the doorway with identical expressions of helpless fury, and she made a decision. She pulled the book from the shelf, turned to the chapter on fractures. Read it once quickly, then again, slowly. The instructions were clinical and precise, written by a physician who assumed his reader had training. Honora did not have training. She had 21 years of doing things she was not qualified to do because no one else was going to do them. "Ransom," she said, "hold his leg, here and here. Do not let go no matter what he does." Ransom knelt. His hands steady on fence posts and bridles were steady now. "Hewitt, give him something to bite." Hewitt took a leather strap from the shelf and placed it between Prosper's teeth. Prosper, semi-conscious, moaned but did not open his eyes. Honora placed her hands on the broken leg. She could feel the misalignment through the skin, the wrongness of it, the bone shifted out of true. She looked at the diagram in the book. She looked at the leg. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pulled. Prosper screamed through the leather. His body arched off the table. Ransom held. Honora felt the bones shift under her fingers, grind, resist, and then with a sound she would hear in her dreams for years afterwards slide into place. She splinted it with straight branches Hewitt had brought from the woodpile, wrapping them tight with strips torn from a clean sheet. She bound the whole thing in linen and elevated it on folded blankets. Her hands were shaking when she finished, but her hands had been shaking before she started, and she had done it anyway. Hewitt stood in the doorway throughout. He did not enter the room while she worked. He gripped the door frame so hard that the wood groaned, and his face was a mask of stone, and his eyes never left his youngest brother. But when Honora stepped back and said, "The bone is set. We need to keep him warm and watch for fever." Hewitt looked at her, not at Prosper, at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Not gratitude, which she was learning was a word Hewitt did not trade in. Not admiration, which was too distant a thing for what she saw. It was fear. Hewitt Drummond was afraid of losing Prosper the way he had lost his mother, afraid that the mountain he had built around himself was not enough to keep the people he loved alive. Honora stepped toward him. She placed her hand on top of his where it gripped the door frame. 1 second. Light, brief. Then she pulled her hand away. He nodded just once, as if she had said, "He will be all right," even though she had not said it, even though she did not know if it was true. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Honora's life. Prosper developed a fever on the second night, high, relentless, the kind that made him talk to people who were not in the room. He called for his mother. He described plants, their Latin names, their properties, their dangers in a rapid mumble that blurred the line between medicine and delirium. Honora sat beside his bed through the worst nights, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth, checking the splint, reading the medical book by candlelight to make sure she had not missed something. Ransom helped without being asked. He boiled water, carried firewood, washed bandages, and snowmelt. He did not complain. He did not make suggestions. He simply appeared at her elbow whenever something needed doing, as if he had been waiting his entire life for a task he could perform without talking. One night, the worst night when Prosper's fever spiked and his breathing turned shallow and rattling, Honora sat on one side of the bed and Hewitt sat on the other. The candle between them threw their shadows against the wall. Enormous wavering. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, Prosper fought. Honora looked at Hewitt across the bed. His hands were folded in his lap, fingers interlocked, knuckles white. His face was stone, but his eyes in the candlelight were wet. She reached across the bed and touched his hand. Not a grasp, not a squeeze, just the weight of her fingers on his knuckles lighter than the bead on her braid. He did not pull away. He did not respond. but something in his shoulders, some tension she had not consciously registered, released. As if her touch had told him the thing he needed to hear in the only language he still trusted. Prosper's fever broke the next morning. He opened his eyes, looked at Honora, and said in a voice like crumpled paper, "Did you read the chapter on compound fractures or simple fractures?" "Simple," she said. "Good. If it had been compound, you would have needed to cut." "I know," she said. "I read that chapter too, just in case." He smiled thin and tired and closed his eyes and slept. Real sleep, the kind that heals. When Prosper was well enough to sit up and eat porridge, Ransom stood in the doorway of the sick room and looked at Honora with an expression she had not seen from him before. Quiet, unguarded. The expression of a man who has watched someone save the person he loves most and does not have words big enough for what he feels. "You saved my brother," he said. "Prosper's book saved him. I just read it." Ransom shook his head. "Reading the right book at the right time is saving. Do not argue with me about this." He turned and left. And from that day forward, Ransom Drummond never spoke a hard word to Honora Selby again. It was Prosper, recovering, propped up in bed with his splinted leg elevated on pillows, who told Honora about the trunk. "Under the floorboards in the common room," he said. "Mother's trunk. No one has opened it since she died. Hewitt cannot bear to. Ransom pretends it does not exist. I have wanted to open it for years, but I could not do it alone." "Why tell me, Honora asked. Prosper looked at her with eyes that were too wise for 29. "Because you sleep in her room. You cook on her stove. You wear a braid tied by her son. I think she would want you to open it." Honora suggested they do it together, all four of them. Prosper agreed. Ransom resisted, then relented. Hewitt sat in the far corner of the common room when they pried up the boards as far from the trunk as the walls would allow. Honora said, "You do not have to look, but you should be here." The trunk was plain pine brass, hinged unlocked. Prosper lifted the lid. Inside, a wool shawl faded to the color of old smoke. Ransom picked it up, pressed it to his face, inhaled once and set it down fast, turning away. His shoulders shook. A small leather journal. Darla Drummond's handwriting, neat and slanted, 10 years of entries. Prosper read fragments aloud. She wrote about her sons, about watching Hewitt grow quieter each year, about Ransom's temper, which she called the fire he cannot find the hearth for, about Prosper spending too much time alone in the woods. She wrote, "I am afraid that when I go, they will become the mountain itself, hard and cold and alone." And at the bottom of the trunk, a sealed envelope. On the front, in Darla's hand, "For the woman who will come." Honora held the envelope. Her fingers trembled. She looked at the three brothers. Ransom's back was turned, his shoulders still. Prosper sat on the edge of his chair, leaning forward. Hewitt had not moved from the corner, but his eyes were fixed on the envelope with an intensity that made the air around him vibrate. She broke the seal, unfolded the paper, read aloud. "If you are reading this, you were brave enough to climb this mountain. I do not know who you are, but I know you are strong because no one weak would agree to live with three men who know how to build houses but do not know how to build words. They cannot say love, but they can mend a fence, heal a wound, and stay when everyone else leaves. That is the love of mountain men. Not in words, but in hands. Look at their hands and you will see everything they cannot say." The cabin was silent. The fire crackled. Ransom wept openly for the first time in years, his face in his hands, his body heaving. Prosper put his arms around his brother. Hewitt stood behind them both and placed one hand on each of their shoulders, heavy, solid, the weight of a rope over two people who needed shelter. Honora stood outside the circle. She knew this moment belonged to them, to three sons and the mother they had lost. She would not intrude. She would not presume. But then Hewitt raised his head. He looked at her, and he held out his hand, palm open, fingers extended, offering nothing, asking nothing, just the hand open, steady, the hand that had carved her a comb and braided her hair and placed flowers on her windowsill every morning for 2 months without ever once expecting her to notice. Honora stepped forward. She placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers, not tight, not possessive, just certain, the way a man holds something he has decided to keep. He drew her into the circle, and the four of them stood and around the open trunk in the firelight in the cabin. that Darla Drummond had filled with love, and that her sons had emptied with grief, and they said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The letter lay on the table between them, and the words in it written by a dead woman who had somehow known that one day a girl from a Boston orphanage would climb a mountain and find three broken men and a braid and a bone comb and a reason to stay. Those words settled over them like the first snow of winter, quiet and covering and impossible to ignore. Spring came to Broken Ridge the way forgiveness comes to stubborn men, slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow pulled back from the south, facing slopes, first retreating uphill like a tide that had overstayed, leaving behind earth so dark and wet, it looked like the mountain was breathing. The creek swelled with meltwater, running fast and clear over stones that had been locked in ice for 4 months. Wildflowers appeared in the cracks between rocks, purple iris and white columbine, pushing up through the last patches of frost with the blind determination of things that had no choice but to grow. Prosper was walking again. Not well, not without a limp that Honora suspected would be permanent, but walking which was more than any of them had dared to hope during those 3 weeks when his fever turned his speech to Latin plant names and whispered conversations with his dead mother. He used a walking stick Hewitt had carved for him, smooth ash wood, with a handle shaped like a closed fist, and he moved through his herb garden each morning with the careful steps of a man who understood now that the ground could betray you without warning. Ransom had built an addition to the cabin. A fourth room framed in pine, roofed in cedar shingle, he had split by hand through the worst of the winter storms. He called it the guest room, which fooled no one. It was positioned between the common room and the bedroom where Honora slept, and its door frame was wider than the others, wide enough for a man of Hewitt's size to pass through without turning sideways. Ransom did not explain this. Ransom did not explain anything. He built, and the building spoke for him. The question of the wedding pressed against them, like the weather impossible to ignore and dangerous to mishandle. Judge Alton Birch was expected in Thornfield by mid-March, which gave them weeks, not months. The petition from Lorette Galt sat in the judge's saddlebag somewhere on the circuit, 14 signatures, and one woman's conviction that morality could be enforced the way property lines were, the documents and authorities, and the absolute certainty that she was right. Honora needed a minister. The minister in Thornfield, Reverend Pace, was a thin man with a thinner spine who preached sermons about charity on Sunday and ate dinner at Lorette Galt's table on Monday. He would not marry Honora to Hewitt Drummond if Lorette told him not to, and Lorette would most certainly tell him not to. Odette Fenn solved the problem the way she solved most problems, by knowing someone. Reverend Whitaker, she told Honora during a visit to the boarding house in early March. Retired, lives in Moss Fork, the valley on the other side of the North Ridge. 72 years old, bad knees, worse hearing, but his ordination is valid and his signature will hold in any court in the territory. He married me 30 years ago and the paperwork has never been challenged. Will he come up the mountain? Odette smiled the smile of a woman who had been navigating the obstacles of frontier life since before Honora was born. I will ask him, and when I ask, I will bring whiskey because Reverend Whitaker has always found that the Lord's work goes smoother with a little encouragement. She paused and her smile faded into something more serious. But before you ride back up that mountain, there is something I need to tell you, something I should have told you the day you arrived. Honora set down her tea. Odette's face had changed. The sharpness was still there, the intelligence, the toughness that 30 years in Montana territory had beaten into her, like temper into steel. But beneath it was something Honora had not seen before, something that looked like guilt. 20 years ago, Odette said a young woman came to Thornfield on the mail coach. She was 20 years old. She had a cloth suitcase and an ivory comb and a letter from a man she had never met. She was a mail-order bride, just like you. And Honora's hands went still on the table. Her name was Alara Selby. The room contracted, the walls pressed inward. The fire in the hearth seemed to dim, though it had not changed. Honora heard her own pulse in her ears, slow and heavy, like the footsteps of someone approaching from very far away. E.S. The initials on the ivory comb, the initials Hewitt had carved onto the bone comb he had made for her. 2 letters she had carried her entire life without knowing the name they belonged to. Alara. Her mother's name was Alara. Odette spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when they know that every word is a stone being laid into a path, and the path leads somewhere that cannot be reached without pain. Alara Selby had come to Thornfield in 1852 as a mail-order bride for a copper miner named Polk. The marriage lasted 11 months. Polk left for California to chase gold as men did in those years and did not come back as men also did. Alara stayed. She had no money for the coach back east and no family to return to. She took in laundry and mending. She lived in a room above the general store, which in those days was owned by a different family people who have since moved on and been forgotten, as frontier people often are. She became pregnant. The father was Polk, who had been gone for 3 months by the time she realized, or perhaps it was someone else Odette did not know and did not judge. Alara carried the child through a Montana summer and gave birth in October in the back room of Odette's boarding house, on a bed that Odette had made up with clean sheets and the particular fierce tenderness of a woman who understood what it meant to be alone. At the moment your body splits itself open to let new life through. The baby was a girl, small, red-faced with a cry that filled the boarding house like a bell. Alara named her Honora. She was sick after the birth, Odette said. Childbed fever. It took her slowly. She fought it the way some women fight, not with noise, but with stillness, lying in that bed holding you, watching you breathe, memorizing you. She knew she was dying. She knew it before I did. Odette's voice, which had been steady, wavered. She steadied it the way she steadied everything with will. She asked me to send you to Boston, to the orphanage. She said Boston had schools and opportunities that Montana did not have for a baby girl with no father and no family. She said you would have a better chance there. She gave me the comb, the ivory one, and said to send it with you. It was the only thing she owned that was worth keeping. She died 3 days later. I buried her in the cemetery behind the church. There is no headstone. I could not afford one, but I know where she is. Honora sat very still. Her tea had gone cold. The fire cracked. Outside, a horse stamped in the livery, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked at nothing. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the storeroom holding the bone comb. This was different. This was not the cracking of a wall. This was the wall coming down entirely, and behind it was not pain, but clarity. The clear ringing understanding that she had not come to Montana by accident. She had not answered an advertisement in a Boston newspaper and traveled 6 weeks by stagecoach on a whim. She had come home. The road that began in this town in a room above a general store, in the arms of a dying woman who named her and loved her and let her go, that road had bent through 21 years and 1,000 miles and brought her back to the exact place she had started. There is more, Odette said. Alara knew Darla Drummond, the Drummond boy's mother. They were not close friends, but they knew each other the way women in small places know each other, by proximity and necessity, and the shared understanding that the frontier was not built for them, but they were going to live on it anyway. Darla helped Alara in the final weeks. She brought food. She washed your clothes, tiny things small enough to fit in one hand. She held you while Alara slept. Honora closed her eyes. Darla Drummond, the woman whose room she slept in. The woman whose shawl smelled of smoke and lavender. The woman whose letter said, "For the woman who will come." I think Darla knew, Odette said softly, or hoped, that one day you would come back, that the road would bring you here. I do not know if she believed in God or fate or just the stubbornness of women, but she wrote that letter and she put it in that trunk and she waited. And when she died, the letter waited for her. Honora opened her eyes. Why did you not tell me when I arrived? Odette met her gaze without flinching. Because I wanted to be sure you were staying for the right reason. Not because this is where your mother died, but because this is where you choose to live. Those are not the same thing. Honora nodded slowly. Odette was right. She had stayed not because of ghosts or guilt or the gravitational pull of a history she did not know. She had stayed because of wildflowers on a windowsill, because of a braid tied by hands that would not speak, because of dried venison left on a doorstep, because of a bone comb carved with 2 initials by a man who had broken years of silence to say a single word. And that word was yet to come, and she was willing to wait for it the way her mother had waited, and Darla had waited, and all the women on all the mountains had always waited, not passively, not helplessly, but with the fierce, quiet certainty that some things are worth the time they take. She stood. She embraced Odette, wrapping her arms around the older woman's shoulders, and Odette, who had not been embraced in years, held her back tight the way you hold something you have been carrying for 2 decades and are finally allowed to set down. Thank you, Honora said, for keeping her, for keeping me. Odette wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so practical it was almost defiant. Go marry that silent man of yours. And when the judge comes, you stand in that courtroom and you tell them who you are. All of who you are. The wedding took place on a Tuesday in the second week of March on the porch of the Drummond cabin in the late afternoon when the light came across the valley at an angle that turned everything, the pine trees, the melting snow, the weathered wood into gold. 6 people attended: Honora, Hewitt, Ransom, Prosper leaning on his walking stick, Odette, who had ridden up the mountain on a borrowed horse, refusing assistance at every switchback, and Reverend Whitaker, 72 years old, white-bearded, windburned, who had indeed been persuaded by whiskey and by Odette's description of the circumstances which she had delivered with the narrative skill of a woman who understood that every good deed requires a good story to set it in motion. Honora wore Darla Drummond's dress. Prosper had found it in the trunk folded beneath the shawl, a simple cotton dress the color of creek water in summer, pale blue, with white buttons and lace at the cuffs that had yellowed with age, but still held its shape. It smelled of cedar and thyme. It fit as if Darla had sewn it with this exact moment in mind, which perhaps she had in the way that mothers sometimes prepare for futures they will not live to see. Honora's hair was braided. Hewitt had done it that morning on the porch in the early light, while the Reverend was still sleeping and the coffee was still boiling. He had divided her hair into 3 sections with the same careful precision he always used, and he had woven them together, and at the end he had threaded the 3 beads into place, bone greenstone, wooden mountain, each one a chapter, each one a man, each one a piece of the story that had brought her from a 40-bed orphanage to the top of a mountain where the sky was close enough to lean against. The ceremony was short. Reverend Whitaker read from a Bible so old, its cover had been replaced with deerskin. He spoke about covenant, about the promises people make not to God or to society, but to each other in the quiet spaces where no one is watching. He asked Honora if she took this man. She said yes. Her voice was clear, and it carried across the porch and into the valley, and Odette, standing beside Prosper, wiped her eyes and did not pretend she was not crying. Then the Reverend turned to Hewitt. Do you, Hewitt Drummond, take this woman to be your wife, to have, and to hold from this day forward? The silence that followed lasted 5 heartbeats. Honora counted them. She felt them in the beat at her wrist, in the braid on her shoulder, in the soles of her feet, on the porch planks that Amos Drummond had nailed down 25 years ago, and that had held ever since. Ransom stopped breathing. Prosper gripped his walking stick with both hands. Odette closed her eyes. The Reverend waited because he was old enough to know that some words take longer to arrive than others. Hewitt opened his mouth. His voice came from a place so deep it seemed to originate not in his throat but in the ground beneath him, in the rock and root and bedstone of the mountain itself. It was rough. It was raw. It was the voice of a man who had not used it in 5 years, and it cracked on the single syllable, the way ice cracks on a river when spring finally wins. Yes, one word. The first word he had spoken since the night he said something terrible to his dying mother and swore he would never speak again. One word dragged up from the bottom of 5 years of silence and laid on the porch like a stone pulled from a field, heavy and necessary and final. Reverend Whitaker, who had officiated more than 200 weddings in 40 years of ministry, would tell Odette later over the whiskey he had been promised that he had never heard the word yes carry that much weight. That it sounded less like an answer and more like a man breaking open a door he had sealed shut and stepping through it into a room he had been afraid to enter. And that the look on the bride's face when she heard it, the way her eyes went bright and her lips pressed together and her chin lifted, not with pride exactly, but with the bone-deep satisfaction of a woman who has waited for something without knowing what she was waiting for and has finally heard it spoken. That look, he said, was the reason he still believed the work was worth doing. Hewitt held Honora's hand. She held his. The Reverend pronounced them married. Prosper applauded. Ransom nodded once, a nod so heavy it seemed to settle something in him that had been unsettled for years. Odette wept openly and without apology. The marriage certificate was signed on the kitchen table in ink that Prosper mixed from walnut hulls on paper that the Reverend carried in his Bible for exactly this purpose. 2 witnesses, Odette Fenn and Prosper Drummond. The document was real. The document was legal. and the document would hold. That evening, after the Reverend had ridden back down the mountain, and Odette had refused to stay the night because she did not trust her chickens to survive without supervision, the four of them sat on the porch in the last light, Honora and Hewitt on the bench, Prosper in the chair with his leg extended, Ransom on the railing, one boot up, looking at the valley the way he always looked at the valley, as if he were standing guard over something that did not know it was being guarded. Hewitt reached for Honora's braid. She felt his fingers find the leather cord, find the beads, and then she felt him threading something new onto the end. A fourth bead. She waited until he was finished, then reached back and touched it. It was metal, small, round, smooth. She could feel the shape of it against her fingertip, a circle, a ring. Not a wedding ring, not a band meant for a finger, but a ring nonetheless, forged from brass, hammered thin, bent closed. He had made it in the storeroom, she realized, during those weeks when she thought the sound of metal on metal was him repairing tools. She understood what it meant. Not marriage, because they had already done that on a porch in front of a reverend with one word. This was something else. This was the word underneath the word, the promise that lived beneath the promise. Home. She touched the bead and she did not turn around. She leaned back just slightly until her shoulder rested against his chest, and she felt the warmth of him. The solidity, the sheer physical fact of a man who had been a wall and a silence and a shadow for 5 years, and who was now in this moment on this porch, in this light, something else entirely. He did not put his arm around her. He did not need to. He was the mountain. She was leaning against it, and that was enough. Judge Alton Birch arrived in Thornfield on the 15th of March riding a gray mare that looked as tired and weathered as its rider. He was 65, white-haired, with a face that had been carved by decades of wind and difficult decisions into something that looked like a relief map of the territory he served. He carried a leather satchel full of petitions, complaints, land disputes, and one document from Lorette Galt requesting the moral investigation of a young woman named Honora Selby. The hearing was held in the Thornfield Church, the only building with enough seats. Lorette Galt arrived first, dressed in black, her petition in a leather folder, her certainty wrapped around her like armor. Behind her came the 14 women who had signed, though Honora noticed that 3 of them would not meet her eyes, and one, a young wife named Cecily Pratt, looked actively ill. Honora arrived with Hewitt. They rode in together on a single horse, which was not strategic but practical, as they only had 2 horses, and Ransom and Prosper needed the other to make the trip. But the image of Honora on the saddle and Hewitt behind her, his arms bracketing her to hold the reins, his shoulders blocking the wind, was not lost on the townspeople who watched from porches and windows. Whatever Lorette Galt had told them about the arrangement on Broken Ridge, the reality of the couple on the horse told a different story. A man and a woman, a husband and a wife, nothing more, nothing less. Inside the church, the pews were full. Honora walked to the front, Hewitt beside her, Ransom and Prosper behind. The 4 of them took up more than a pew. Hewitt alone filled a space meant for 2 people. The townspeople stared the way townspeople always stare at mountain men who come down into civilization with the mix of curiosity and unease that large, quiet, capable men have always inspired in people who live behind walls. Judge Birch sat at a table at the front of the church. He put on spectacles, opened his satchel, and read the petition aloud. His voice was dry, measured, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that the law was a tool, not a weapon, and that wielding it required the same care as wielding an axe. The petition requested that the court investigate the moral standing of one, Honora Selby, an unmarried woman of unknown background living with 3 unmarried men in an isolated homestead, and that the court place her under the guardianship of an appropriate institution for her protection and the protection of community standards. When he finished reading, Judge Birch looked up. "Mrs. Galt, you filed this petition." Lorette stood. "I did, Your Honor, on behalf of the decent women of this town who are concerned about the example being set." The example being what specifically? A young woman alone with 3 men, on a mountaintop, without supervision or chaperone. It is indecent, Your Honor. It violates the standards we have worked to maintain in this community. Judge Birch turned to Honora. "Miss Selby, do you wish to respond?" Honora stood. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of Hewitt beside her, silent, enormous, radiating the particular calm of a man who has decided that whatever happens next, he will not leave. She was aware of the braid on her shoulder, 4 beads catching the light from the church window as bone and greenstone and cedar and brass, each one a chapter, each one a witness. "My name is not Selby," she said. "It is Drummond, Honora Drummond, and I was married to Hewitt Drummond on the 2nd of March by Reverend Josiah Whitaker, who is ordained and whose credentials are on file with the Montana Territorial Authority." She placed the marriage certificate on the judge's table. He examined it, holding it to the light, reading the signatures, checking the date. "This appears to be in order," he said. Lorette's mouth thinned. That marriage was arranged specifically to circumvent this petition. She lived with those men for months before any wedding took place. Honora turned to face Lorette directly. "I lived in my own room. I cooked. I cleaned. I kept house. Any woman employed as domestic help in a household of men could be described the same way. If domestic service is immoral, Mrs. Galt, then half the women in the territory are guilty of the same charge." A murmur went through the church. Not laughter exactly, but the sound of people recognizing a point well made. Judge Birch raised a hand for silence. "Mrs. Drummond, is there anything else you wish to say?" Honora had not planned what came next. She had planned to present the certificate, to answer questions, to be calm and factual, and to let the law do what the law was supposed to do. But standing in that church in Darla Drummond's dress, with Hewitt's silence at her back and 4 beads on her braid and a bone comb in her pocket carved by a man who had spoken 1 word in 5 years and used it to marry her, she found that the law was not enough. The law could protect her, but only the truth could free her. "Your Honor," she said, "my mother's name was Alara Selby. She came to this town more than 20 years ago. She was a mail-order bride like me. Her husband left her. She was pregnant and alone. She gave birth in Odette Fenn's boarding house, and she died 3 days later of childbed fever. She was buried in the cemetery behind this church in an unmarked grave because no one in this town helped her enough to afford a headstone." The church went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Odette Fenn was the only person who stood by her. "Odette sent me to Boston because my mother believed I would have a better life there. And I did, in the sense that I survived. But I did not have a life. I had an existence. I had a bed in a room with 39 other children and a number on a card and a comb with my mother's initials that I held every night because it was the only proof I had that someone somewhere once had loved me enough to leave me something." She paused. In the third pew, Cecily Pratt was crying silently. 2 other women had lowered their eyes. "I sold that comb," Honora said, "in this store, at that counter, for $7.50. To bail Ransom Drummond out of a hitching post where he was chained like a mouse for a cattle dispute that has not been proven. I sold my mother's only relic for a man I had never met because it was the right thing to do, and because I was not going to ride up a mountain to meet my husband knowing I had left his brother in chains." She looked at Lorette Galt, not with anger, not with triumph, with the steady, clear-eyed gaze of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has learned to use it. "Mrs. Galt, you filed this petition because you believe a woman living with 3 men is immoral. But my mother lived in this town alone, pregnant, dying, and no one filed a petition to help her. No one collected signatures to find her a doctor or a midwife or a warm meal. She died in a back room and was buried without a name on her grave. If you want to talk about the moral standards of this community, I suggest you start there." The silence in the church was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Judge Birch removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, and looked at Lorette Galt with the expression of a man who has been doing this work for 40 years and has long since lost the ability to be surprised by human behavior, but has never lost the ability to be disappointed by it. "Mrs. Galt," he said, "I am dismissing your petition. The marriage certificate is valid. There is no evidence of wrongdoing, and I will note for the record that this court takes a dim view of petitions motivated by personal animus rather than genuine concern for public welfare." He paused. "I would further suggest that the next time you wish to defend the moral character of this town, you begin by extending basic Christian charity to the people who live in it rather than seeking to remove them." He closed his satchel. "This matter is concluded." Honora walked out of the church into sunlight that felt different than it had an hour ago. Warmer, wider, as if the sky itself had expanded to make room for something that had been compressed too long. Hewitt walked beside her, matching his enormous stride to her smaller one without being asked. He had not spoken during the hearing. He had not needed to. His presence, immense, silent, immovable, had said everything his voice could not. I am here. She is mine. We are not leaving. Ransom and Prosper waited outside. Ransom stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the church door the way a man scans a tree line for predators. When Honora emerged, he uncrossed his arms, and something in his posture changed, a loosening, a settling, as if a weight he had been carrying for months had finally been set down in a place where it could rest. Prosper smiled, not his usual half smile, his careful wry, holding something back smile. A full smile. The smile of a man who had gambled everything on the belief that one letter, one invitation, one woman on a mule could save three brothers from becoming the mountain itself, and had won. Odette stood on the porch of her boarding house across the street, arms folded, watching. When Honora looked at her, Odette nodded once, a nod that said everything a nod can say between two women who understand each other. Well done. Now go home. On the ride back up the mountain, Honora and Hewitt took the eastern trail the long way around through the valley where the snow had melted first and the grass was already high and green. The trail passed through the ruins of Deerfield, the abandoned settlement Honora had heard about, but never seen a ghost town that had died not from fire or violence, but from the slow, quiet departure of people who had come west looking for something and found only the absence of it. They rode through in silence. Collapsed walls, chimney stacks standing alone like monuments to rooms that no longer existed. A church with half a roof and a cross that had fallen sideways and lay in the weeds like something tired. The wind moved through the empty doorways and made sounds that were almost but not quite like voices. Hewitt stopped his horse. He looked at the ruins for a long time. Then he reached forward and placed his hand over Honora's, where it rested on the saddle horn. His palm covered her hand entirely warm and rough, and he left it there for 10 seconds, 15, 20. He did not squeeze. He did not pull. He just rested his hand on hers. And in that touch was everything he could not say and would perhaps never say, but which existed between them as surely as the mountain existed beneath them. I am here. I am not leaving. This will not happen to us. They rode on. The ruins fell behind. The trail climbed. The pines grew taller. The air grew thinner and colder and cleaner. And by the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low, and the valley was filling with purple shadow, and the porch was waiting for them the way it always waited, solid and patient and facing west. That night after supper, after Prosper had gone to his room with his book and Ransom had gone to check the cattle, Honora sat on the porch with Hewitt. The stars were out thick and white, and the half-moon was rising over the eastern ridge. She had the bone comb in her lap. She ran her fingers over the teeth, feeling each one, feeling the two letters carved into the spine. I know my mother's name now, she said quietly. Alara. Hewitt did not move, but she felt his attention shift the way you feel the wind change direction before you see the trees bend. She died in Thornfield. She was alone. Odette took care of her. Your mother Darla helped her in the end, brought food, held me while my mother slept. She paused. I think your mother's letter was for me. Not any woman, me. I think she knew, or hoped. She looked at the comb, the bone teeth, the carved initials, a comb made by a man who had never asked what those letters meant, who had only known that they mattered, and had carved them into bone because he understood that some things must be preserved even when the original is gone. You could not have known, she said. When you carved these letters, you did not know my mother's name. You only knew they were important to me, and you made them part of something new. She turned to look at him. He was watching her as he always watched her, with those amber eyes that held more than any words he might have spoken. Eyes that had watched her from the porch the first day she arrived and had not stopped watching since. That is what you do, she said. You take what is broken and you make it into something that works. The comb, the cabin, us. He looked at her for a long time. The moonlight caught the side of his face, the strong jaw, the stubble, the small scar above his eyebrow from a piece of flying wood when he was young. He was not handsome in the way that word is usually used. He was handsome the way a mountain is handsome, not because it is pretty, but because it is there and it is real and it will be there tomorrow. Then he did something he had not done since the wedding. He opened his mouth, and this time the word that came out was not yes. It was not a response to a question that someone else had asked. It was a word he chose. A word he had been carrying, she realized, since the day she arrived, since the day she sold her mother's comb for his brother's freedom, since the day she burned her last letter, and stayed since the night he braided her hair for the first time, and his hands shook and she did not mention it. He had been carrying this word the way a river carries a stone slowly, persistently, wearing it smooth until it was ready to be set down. Honora, her name. Spoken in that voice, the voice of rock and root, of deep places, of a man who had broken 5 years of silence twice, and both times for her. The first time to say yes to a question about forever. The second time to say her name, which was not just her name, but everything he had never said and might never say again, compressed into 4 syllables that hung in the night air like the last note of a song. She did not speak. She turned back to the valley. She leaned against his shoulder. He did not put his arm around her. He did not move. He sat the way the mountain sat, steady and permanent and undeniable. And she rested against him the way the snow rests against the mountain in winter, knowing it will melt, knowing the mountain will remain. From inside the cabin, she heard Prosper turn a page. From the stable, she heard Ransom close a stall door. The ordinary sounds of a household settling into night, the sounds of a home that had been empty for 6 years and was not empty anymore. She reached back and touched her braid. 4 beads and a bone carving. She counted them with her fingers the way a woman might count the days of a calendar, or the links of a chain, or the reason she has to stay in a place that was not the place she intended to go but turned out to be the place she was always going. Bone. The beginning. The first gift from a man who did not speak. Greenstone leaf. Patience. The second gift from a man who healed with plants and gentle words. Cedar Mountain. Trust. The third gift from a man who was afraid to trust and gave it anyway. Brass ring. Home. The fourth gift from a man who said yes when it was the hardest word in the world, and Honora when it was the most important. And at the very end of the braid, tied with twine, a small piece of bone carved with 2 letters. E.S. Elara Selby, her mother. Put there by Hewitt, who did not know the name behind the initials, who knew only that they mattered, who understood that love is not always knowing the story but caring enough to preserve it. Honora sat on the porch of the cabin on Broken Ridge, with her husband beside her and his brothers inside, and her mother's initials in her hair, and the valley spread out below them like an open hand. The stars turned slowly overhead. The wind carried the smell of pine and snowmelt, and the first green things pushing up through the last of the frost. She thought about the stagecoach, the 6 weeks of rattling and dust, the letter she had read 400 times, the ivory comb she had sold for $7.50, the man chained to a hitching post, the 3 shadows on the ridge, the wildflowers on the windowsill, the first braid, the fever and the book and the bone setting straight in her hands, the trunk and the letter and the mother she had never known and the mother who had known her before she arrived. The word yes spoken like a door opening, and her name spoken like a benediction in a voice that had been silent for 5 years and had chosen out of all the words in the language to begin again with her. She had come to Montana to marry a stranger. She had found 3 strangers and married the quietest one. She had sold her mother's comb and been given a new one. She had burned her last letter and been given a home. She had set a bone and been given a family. She had stood in a church and been given her own story, the one that started 21 years ago in a back room with a dying woman and a newborn girl and a comb with 2 initials that meant everything and nothing and everything again. Every morning after that, Honora woke before dawn. She combed her hair with the bone comb Hewitt had made, each tooth smooth and precise, the initials E.S. pressed against her palm like a handshake from across the years. She braided her hair and threaded the beads into place. 4 in a carving, the whole history of how she came to be here, condensed into objects small enough to hang from a braid. Sometimes Prosper had already made coffee. Sometimes Ransom left a fresh egg on the windowsill, brown and warm, still carrying the heat of the hen. And sometimes, most mornings, there was a wildflower on the sill, placed there by hands she never saw but always recognized. The collection of wooden animals on the kitchen shelf continued to grow, each one different, each one carved in the dark of the porch by a man who could not speak, but whose hands never stopped talking. A fox for curiosity, an owl for patience, a hawk for the way she watched, a wolf, the very first one, for the creature she was when she arrived lean and watchful and too stubborn to die. Honora touched them each morning as she passed. She did not rearrange them. She did not dust them. She let them accumulate the thin layer of wood smoke and cooking grease in time that made them part of the cabin, the way the stones in the hearth were part of the cabin, not decoration, but structure. And in the evenings on the porch, Hewitt Drummond sat beside his wife and carved. He did not speak. He had given his 2 words yes and Honora, and they were enough. They would always be enough. Because the woman beside him did not need words, she needed hands. And his hands, enormous, scarred, calloused, capable of killing bears and splitting timber and carrying a grown man 2 miles through a blizzard, those hands braided her hair each night with a tenderness that made the stars seem clumsy. 3 beads and a ring and a mother's name, a braid that held the whole story. A silence that was not empty but sacred. In a cabin on a mountain where 4 people, none of whom had been chosen by anyone before, had chosen each other, 1 beat at a time, 1 day at a time, one quiet, unspoken, irreversible act of love at a time. The girl from the orphanage had climbed the mountain, Irondy Mountain. She had sold her comb to free a stranger, and she had been given back everything she lost, not the same, never the same, but shaped by hands that knew the difference between what is broken and what is waiting to be made new. And that, if you listened closely enough, was the sound the braid made when the wind moved through it on the porch of the Drummond cabin at the top of Broken Ridge. Not a sound exactly, a whisper. The whisper of bone and stone and wood and brass clicking together softly, telling the story over and over to anyone patient enough to hear it. A story about a woman who was not afraid of silence, and 3 men who finally understood that silence was not the same as having nothing to say. Part 3, word count approximately 7,100 words. Total manuscript estimate across all 3 parts approximately 21,300 words. This falls within the target range of 20,000 to 22,000 words. The manuscript is complete. No additional sections are required.